The Saw timeline is really well thought out. Despite the fact there are constant flashbacks, retcons, and events being told out of order, you can still piece together everything in a way that makes sense. Except for the history of this guy, Logan Nelson. If you want to see how Nelson breaks the timeline and my idea of how it can be fixed, then stick around to the end of this video. Hello and welcome to Horror History. My name is the Professor, not that professor, Professor CZsWorld, and in today's lesson, I'm talking Saw. More specifically, the most recent of Jigsaw's many disciples, Lieutenant Logan Nelson. Nelson made his debut in the 8th movie, Jigsaw, and there are still unanswered questions about his character that may be left open for future installments, as hinted at by the directors, the Spierig brothers. I will talk about those possibilities, but before we can get there, we've got to take it back to the debut of the first disciple. Logan Nelson was born on August 18, 1973. He grew up to become a medic, and at 6'2", 195 pounds, he was also a pretty big force to be reckoned with. When Logan was 29, he was doing his residency in Metropolitan City at the Angel of Mercy Hospital, the same hospital that Dr. Lawrence Gordon was treating a patient named John Kramer. One day in 2003, he was responsible for labeling a couple of x-rays and accidentally switched the labels, an event that prevented John's doctor from correctly diagnosing his brain tumor in its early stages. That small mistake ended up being one of his biggest mistakes, because it was this that caused Kramer, who would one day become known as the Jigsaw Killer, to include Nelson in his first ever game, a challenge that included 5 contestants fighting for their lives to prove that they cherished life. He is put into a room in a secluded barn with 4 other wrongdoers, but the sedation used on Logan doesn't wear off at the same time as the others, so by the time he wakes up, he's nearly already been pulled into a wall of spinning saw blades. He ends up getting cut by the blades, leaving permanent scars on his back, but luckily, John realized that he didn't have a fair chance and didn't want him dying over an honest mistake, so he ran out to save him and give him a second chance. After stitching up his back, he made Nelson his apprentice, teaching him Jigsaw's moral code and engineering techniques. Together, they built what would become known as one of Jigsaw's most iconic traps, the reverse bear trap, and John would impress the mantra, "We'll speak for the dead," which had a great impact on Nelson going forward. John's partnership with Nelson would come to an end, however, later that year when Nelson shipped out to serve in the military, where he was a lieutenant from May 2003 through July 2005.
Logan was a medic in Fallujah.
Fallujah is short for Al-Fallujah, a city in Iraq where 2 of the biggest battles of America's Iraq War took place. Keith Hunt also served in Fallujah and mentions that even as a medic, Logan took out some Taliban guys before being captured. He was tortured, possibly with hydrofluoric acid, which he recognizes the effects of as a medical examiner years later. According to Nelson's file, he was imprisoned by Republican Guard loyalists for 5 months and 11 days. During his imprisonment, along with 4 other members of his medical patrol, he was subjected to an array of interrogation methods for the purpose of discovering his unit's plans and for the recapture of Fallujah. This is almost certainly where he developed his stone-cold demeanor. We see it later when he's being questioned by Keith Hunt, and of course at the end where he goes full punishment mode. Lieutenant Nelson was released in a prisoner exchange brokered by Army General Fitzpatrick in May 2005, at which time he was transferred to VISN-5, Virginia Capital Healthcare Network in Maryland, where he received PTSD treatment for 23 months. In other words, he was still jumping at shadows after getting free, so they treated him in a hospital for veterans from May 2005 until April 2007. During that time, a patient exhibited signs of extreme anxiety and antisocial behavior for approximately 7 weeks. Much like me when I'm editing a video. During which time Dr. Perry prescribed a regime of serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, with limited success. We don't know exactly when Logan met his wife, but it seems like his daughter was conceived in December of 2005 while he was still under treatment. Nelson was eventually released under his own recognizance on August 9, 2006, but suffered a severe relapse following the birth of his daughter, Melissa. Lieutenant Nelson lashed out at a neighbor with a yard sign and was arrested following an argument with his wife's physician, in which Logan repeatedly struck the doctor in the head and was later sued for injuries. Man, I wonder what that yard sign said. Go figure. Nelson considered himself a broken man after the war.
10 years ago, I came out of the war a broken man.
Yes. That's what I just said. But Jigsaw helps him put the pieces of his life back together again, like a jigsaw puzzle. See what they did there? Now this is where the timing of events gets a little bit wonky, because I don't really think Lieutenant Nelson linked up with Jigsaw again after the war. Long story short, because Jigsaw was pretty busy with some other stuff at the time, and he was dead by the time that Nelson had his big relapse and yard sign incident. I think what Logan means with that line is that it was Jigsaw's teachings that helps him eventually overcome the PTSD. There are some other possibilities, but I'll talk about those a little bit later. He was readmitted to VISN-5 on September 12, 2006, and improved steadily throughout the rest of the year. Nelson was re-released on December 12, 2006, and has not been prescribed SSRIs since May of 2007. He was released from the care of Dr. Angus Perry on February 10, 2007, and his breakdown in the summer of 2006 is considered an aberration, and Dr. Perry signed off on his condition, insisting that Nelson is not a threat to himself. He was awarded a Purple Heart on October 5, 2007. So all of this, from 2003 to 2007, being in the war overseas and dealing with his own mental illness battle back home, home helps explain why he, as one of Jigsaw's disciples, wasn't a factor during the 7 Saw films, which take place from 2004 through 2007, not including flashbacks. So this point, an argument can be made for the morality of Nelson's character, but what would happen after returning to the metropolitan area caused him to take an ever darker outlook on life. Logan used his knowledge in the field of healthcare to become a medical examiner not long after the Jigsaw saga had concluded. But despite Jigsaw leaving a lasting legacy on the city, criminals eventually started to run rampant again, and bodies continued to pile up. During his first year in county, the body of an 8-year-old girl showed up on Nelson's examination table, an event he felt could have been prevented. It happened one day after Detective Halloran, who I'm just now realizing I don't know the first name of, captured a predator named Alistor Schultz and brought him in for questioning. But during the interrogation, he got too rough, resulting in Schultz getting off on a technicality where he quickly took his anger out on an innocent young girl. Logan held this against Halloran for a long time, which wasn't helped by the fact that this was the first of many transgressions on Halloran's part. As innocent bodies continued to pile up on Nelson's table, well, okay, they didn't literally pile up, he looked at them one at a time probably, but as the body count continued to grow, so did Nelson's disgust for Detective Halloran and his methods. He also called Halloran an impulsive asshole in the media a couple times, which created a tension between the two that everyone knew about. It wasn't just Halloran's excessive use of force that bothered Nelson though. He also had a penchant for letting criminals off the hook. The most notable example was Edgar Munson, a meth addict, thief, and assaulter who wiggled out of 2 arrests because he was Halloran's informant. I'd cite the lack of discipline as a major reason that Munson never cleaned up his act and ended up committing the most heinous crime of all, putting ketchup on a hot dog.
Game's just getting started.
Nah, I'm just kidding. He f***ing murdered Nelson's wife. I think it was at this point that Nelson probably started plotting his revenge. With Jigsaw's words, "We speak for the dead," still echoing in his head. With his unique position as the county medical examiner and with his close proximity to Halloran and his department, Nelson began paying close attention to the criminals that Halloran let off of the hook. His aim was to recreate the game that Jigsaw had placed him in all of those years ago, using criminals from Halloran's botched cases, along with Halloran and himself. Nelson discovered his first candidate in 2011. A degenerate gambler named Malcolm Neal was partially responsible for the death of his wife when people he owed money to broke into his home and slit Mrs. Neal's throat. Halloran never managed to put him away for the illegal gambling charges, and Neal fit the profile of one of the guys from Jigsaw's original game at the barn. So Nelson took things into his own hands to punish him. Over the next 5 years, he kept his eyes open and found 2 other criminals that he deemed similar to the other 2 contestants of John's game at the barn. In 2016, he abducted them and put them through their own game. As expected, they made the same mistakes as their predecessors did, though it's not really clear if Nelson made the games winnable like Jigsaw did, or if he was just torturing them to avenge the dead. The game began when Nelson abducted his wife's killer, Edgar Munson, and left him in an abandoned warehouse with an audio tape created by splicing together old archival audio of John Kramer to make it look like Jigsaw was back from the dead and conducting a new game. Surprisingly, it didn't end up sounding like a bad soundboard prank call.
Thank you for calling the front desk. This is Jake. How can I help you?
Hello. Greetings.
Oh, wait, you're the Saw dude.
There's a man in the room with you.
Who's watching Saw? What the f***?
Welcome to your rebirth. You think it's over just because I'm dead?
The tape told Munson he had to get to a certain rooftop with a trigger that would start the next game. He arrived there, chased by police, and each of them aimed to destroy the trigger, not knowing that Nelson was watching from another rooftop with a sniper, which he used to shoot Munson simultaneously. After using his inside access to obtain a capsule of John Kramer's blood, he injects it into Malcolm Neal's fingernails before putting the bloody body on display in public for police to find and ultimately bring back to him to examine with his very lovely assistant, Eleanor Bonneville. In fact, he wisely allows her to be the one to notice the jigsaw piece he had cut out of the victim's head. She doesn't notice the flash drive lodged into his face, so Nelson makes sure that the police know about it by bringing it to light himself. On the outside of it, the text reads, "And then there were 4. The drive contains an audio file, so why don't we roll it?
The games have begun again, and they will not stop until the sins against the innocent are atoned for. I will take care of the next 4. You take care of the rest."
Just as Jigsaw and his other apprentices did during the Saw saga, Logan is leaving this as a message directly for Detective Halloran. That evening, Nelson would deposit the next body from his recreated game at the pig farm. This one was supposed to resemble a woman named Carly from the original game. He tosses her body from the rooftop of St. Peter's Hospital, the same hospital where Edgar Munson is being treated for his gunshot wound. This time, the body had a sign that says, "and then there were 3. The purpose of counting down like this is to crank up the pressure on Detective Halloran and force him to solve the mystery, to find and put a stop to the game while there are still living contestants to rescue. However, it's all a facade, because the only 2 living contestants at this point are Nelson himself and Detective Halloran, who is being lured into this game's location by this lie. Once again, Nelson is called in to examine a corpse that he created, this time dropping more hints by pointing out that the victim was killed by hydrofluoric acid, not a rooftop fall. A nice little homage to one of Jigsaw's traps in Saw 6, where the same acid is used in the game where William Easton is executed. It's also probably a satisfying act for Nelson, who was also tortured with HF acid during his time being imprisoned in the war. Before the last member of the game is revealed, something strange comes up with Nelson's assistant, Eleanor, that completely changes Logan's plan. That night, Logan has to stay late at work and video chats his daughter and the babysitter to say goodnight, highlighting what I think is a possible weakness for him going forward. He clearly cares a lot about his daughter. There's only one Jigsaw apprentice of past who has a kid. I'll give you a clue. They used to work at the same hospital together. Lawrence Gordon found out how hard it is to have your child taken as a hostage of part of Jigsaw's game way back in the first movie. But we've also seen similar tactics used to manipulate characters like Eric Matthews and Jeff Denlin. After getting off the call, detectives Halloran and Hunt confront Nelson and explain that his hot assistant, has been sending a lot of web traffic to a website called Jigsaw Rules. And no, I'm not sure if it's called that because they're fans of Jigsaw, you know, like, hey, yeah, bro, Jigsaw rules, he's the best. Or if it's more of a reference to the fact that Jigsaw holds these games where the rules have to be followed.
Why do you need Amanda in the game?
To ensure that the rules are followed.
It's also unclear if all of that traffic was coming from Eleanor or if Logan was also responsible for some of it. Eleanor obviously used it for her weird hobby of recreating saw traps, but Logan could have used it at some point as a resource for his version of the barn game. This is where Logan's intellect comes into play, what makes him more dangerous than some of Jigsaw's former disciples. He's able to turn this dangerous situation into his advantage, and here's how he does it. First, he defends Eleanor, even though making her a suspect could be advantageous for him. Instead, he uses reverse psychology. By protecting Eleanor instead of himself, he causes the detectives to actually become more suspicious of her. It's not 100% clear if he knew he was being followed that night, as he found Eleanor at the Brewer's Moon and got her to take him to her studio, a warehouse filled with her own recreations of Jigsaw's now famous traps, but upon seeing this collection, Nelson realizes how he can further use it to confuse Hunt, who's tailing them, by muddying the clarity of the situation. Eleanor shows him the human blender, which he recognizes from Kramer's barn game, but he plays dumb, telling her that no victims died in anything like that. It's amazing that he was able to keep a straight face through all of this, perhaps highlighting his sociopathic tendencies, because Logan already knew full well that the next victim of his version of the barn game was killed in a blender just like this one, so he plotted to plant the next body in Eleanor's studio. He was especially busy that night though. He also had time to kidnap Edgar Munson from the hospital under the nose of the sleeping guard and relocate his body into the tomb of John Kramer, who was set to be dug up in the morning in order to prove to the public that he was still dead. This, of course, sent people into a frenzy, lending more credence to the idea that the original Jigsaw had returned from beyond the grave. Logan never planned on Eleanor being a Jigsaw fangirl or Kramer's body being dug up, but he was able to stay calm and turn both of these potential subversions into advantages. And that's what makes him such a scary carrier of the Jigsaw legacy. He's able to suppress the rage that used to get him in trouble after the war and become a collected, calculating psychopath, which is my favorite kind of villain. The next steps after that were pretty easy, but would not be without a couple of challenges. The most obvious was to plan to cut out Jigsaw pieces in Halloran's freezer. Remember, the goal isn't to pin the crime on Eleanor, she's just a distraction for the cops right now. The real one to take the fall has to be Halloran. Then, Keith Hunt shows up to arrest Nelson, thinking he and Bonneville are in cahoots together and killing the new victims. Again, he's able to turn the situation on its head by offering all he knows, essentially making it look like Halloran is the one trying to frame him. He cites the evidence that lines up perfectly with Halloran being guilty because he set everything up that way. All of the victims are Halloran's old cases, and he gave the order to shoot the remote that Munson was holding way back, you know, when that happened. Logan was the one who fired it, but nobody knew he was even there. In order to fully clear his name, Nelson suggests that they go back to the medical table and examine Munson. When Hunt isn't looking, he switches the bullet with the one from Halloran's gun. This is honestly kind of the flimsiest thing in the movie. I mean, the body has already been moved by the killer at this point, so I don't see why said killer couldn't just switch the bullet out. I guess Hunt didn't think about that though, because it works. Hunt takes Nelson home and starts to investigate Halloran, giving our boy Nelson some time to find Eleanor, well, she finds him, with the news that she's discovered the location of the game. This is perfect for Logan. I think at this point he realizes that Halloran is following him, and all he has to do is let Eleanor lead them to the barn, exactly where he wants Halloran to be for the final round of the game. The one wild card here is Ms. Bonneville, so he's got to find a way to get rid of her for a little while to give him time to deal with Halloran. Once again, Nelson finds a way to turn this problem into a positive by convincing her that Halloran is the killer and engaging in a fight with him. He tells Eleanor to run before drugging Halloran and taking him to the slaughter room. Now he has one more person believing what he wants them to believe, someone he probably wasn't even counting on being involved. The final round of the game is no game at all, it's a trap. But unlike John Kramer's traps, this one is inescapable. He poses himself inside the room opposite the detective. Fabricated audio of John Kramer's voice tells them that they can escape death if they admit to the reason they deserve to die. The whole thing is a setup to get Halloran to admit to being a dirty cop. All Nelson has to do is sell it. So he gives Halloran the chance to choose who makes their confession first. Letting him choose is secretly the ultimate power move, because if he chooses himself, he'll probably confess. But if he presses Logan's button, then he can sell the scenario even further, because his collar is equipped with fake lasers and fake blood. So that's exactly what he does. He fakes his death in order to scare Halloran into making his confession. A confession of tampering with evidence, taking bribes, putting away innocent people, letting the worst criminals walk free, and letting innocent people die. More than enough to convince most people that Halloran is the one behind the 2016 killings. With that evidence, Logan no longer needs his rival, and after explaining his plan like a typical villain, he activates the real laser cutters and executes Detective Halloran. Yeah, if anyone knows where I can get one of those things, I would love to have it to cut my grapefruit. So remember how I said there was an issue with Nelson's timeline? Yeah, there's an issue with Nelson's timeline. Let's see if we can make some sense of it. Throughout Jigsaw, characters are constantly going around saying that Jigsaw can't be back because he's been dead for 10 years.
Kramer's been dead for 10 years.
John Kramer's dead and has been for 10 years.
See? I told you. That's why I've been saying that Nelson's game takes place in 2016, 10 years after Jigsaw's death in 2006. But at the end of the movie, when Logan does his evil villain speech, he says that John's original game, which he did as a secret test before all of the other games, was 10 years ago.
10 years ago in this very barn, a game was played.
Well, the first game was in 2004, so it can't be 10 years since 2004 and 10 years since 2006 simultaneously. Not if both games are on Earth anyways. The other confusing thing is that Nelson says Jigsaw helped him put together his life after the war. You may remember that he didn't start to recover until September 2006, which is actually after Jigsaw died. So all of this doesn't quite add up as neatly as the 7 Saw films. But there may be a simple explanation. Well, the simplest explanation is that they f***ed up, but there may be a canon explanation as well. There are 2 options really. The first is that the game at the barn didn't really take place before the bathroom game in October 2004. It is stated that Jigsaw's barn game took place before all of the other games, but what if it only took place before all of the other games that the public actually knows about? The earliest known game would be the nerve gas house in Saw 2, which happens in October of 2005. That gets us pretty close to 10 years, but it would actually be 11 years in 2016. But it's easier to clump the game and the rest of John's life together as one event if you do it like that. But there is one snag in that theory, which is that Eleanor's studio has a replica of the hacksaw from the bathroom. You know, the one that Gordon used to escape. Which means the public did find out about the bathroom game at some point. So the barn game probably took place before the bathroom game. There's also the fact that we see Logan and John building the reverse bear trap together, and the reverse bear trap is invented even earlier than the bathroom game. We see Amanda tested by it in May of 2004. That's why I made this video under the idea that Jigsaw's barn game took place shortly after Logan Nelson switched John's x-rays in 2003, and Logan Nelson's barn game took place 10 years after Jigsaw's death in 2006. This makes the information on Nelson's file fit nicely into the series, because it perfectly explains why Nelson never helped John during Saw 1 through 7, because he was at war for part of it and busy being treated for PTSD for the other parts. As for Nelson's line,
10 years ago in this very barn, a game was played.
I think it's possible that he was just generalizing. He was essentially saying, this was all about a decade ago. It's not like he's been counting year by year, but he knows it's been at least 10 years since John Kramer's barn game and about 10 years since his death. The last retort that Halloran tries is when he points out the fact that John Kramer gave victims a choice to try to win the game, and Nelson's response to that is just savage. Roll that shit.
You have a choice. Scream or don't.
So Nelson actually ends up committing the murder himself, unlike Jigsaw, but a lot like some of his other failed disciples like Amanda and Hoffman. Logan Nelson is both a warrior and a tactician. Once groomed to be the next successor to Jigsaw, things went horribly wrong when his rehabilitation was interrupted by service in the military. The post-traumatic stress that is often a symptom of mental illness in Army veterans ends up warping and distorting his still rehabilitating mind into a sociopath and a psychopath, the likes of which we've never seen before. Combine that with his scary physicality and extremely sharp and fast fast acting intelligence, and we could have one of the scariest villains in the Saw franchise going forward. At the end of Jigsaw, the only confirmed survivors among Jigsaw's successors are Logan Nelson, who's strayed from the path of John's teaching, and Lawrence Gordon, who has protected his legacy for the last 12 years. Both are medical masterminds who have also taken on the arts of mechanical engineering and deductive reasoning. One has the advantage of brute force and military background, and the other has 10 times the experience being Jigsaw and 2 unknown apprentices helping him out. Hopefully we get to see these 2 masterminds battle it out, Jigsaw versus Jigsaw in a future movie. It would be an epic battle that forever changes the franchise going forward. So that's it so far for the history of Logan Nelson. Click the video on the left to see more analyses of your favorite horror characters here on Horror History, and let me know which Saw character I should cover next. Remember to subscribe to CZsWorld for new horrors every week, ring that death bell for notifications, and I'll see you in the next one, assuming we both survive.